And we're going to turn to Kathryn Jacobsen. She's an internationally respected health expert who has done field research in Sierra Leone. She also teaches at George Mason University. Kathryn, thanks for being on the program. Let's begin with these 4 family members of Thomas Duncan's quarantined in a small apartment. We've learned they're under armed guard. Nothing has been cleaned. Dirty towels, dirty sheets. First of all, are you surprised that this apartment has not been sanitized?
I think we were not prepared for this to happen. I think we've seen that in the response. Clearly, that needs to be a very high priority to get the apartment clean as soon as possible. And what we need to do is to have every health department in the US and around the world be prepared for a similar response in case anyone else who's been in West Africa shows up and ends up coming down with Ebola after they've traveled.
So Duncan was in Liberia, in Monrovia. He didn't have a fever. They did take his temperature, but he allegedly lied about not having contact with someone who had Ebola. What else could have been done to prevent this man from probably coming to the United States? I mean, he didn't have a fever. He didn't have any symptoms.
Right, and the incubation period is typically about 8 to 10 days, but it can be up to 21 days. And people need to travel. There is not going to be a perfect system for keeping anyone who might have had contact out of the sky. It sounds like the airport system worked, that he did not have a fever when he traveled. And that's really important because if he didn't have a fever, the people on the plane with him were not at risk.
But he lied, so this could happen again. Someone else could lie, they may not have a fever, come to the States, develop the symptoms days later.
Right, and people could fly to the States and not lie, just not know that they had contact.
Right.
So they could have had contact with someone who did not know that he or she had Ebola. They travel, they honestly say, I didn't know that this person that I had contact with was ill and will fall ill. So every country around the world has to be on the lookout for people who may fall ill after they leave an airport. They arrive healthy and they only get sick later on.
So did the hospital in Dallas drop the ball on this? I mean, this man goes to the hospital, they send him home, they give him antibiotics. Was that the right approach?
I think at this point we would all agree, now that we know that he has Ebola, that that was not the right approach. What we need to learn from this is that hospitals and clinics around the world, again, not just in Texas, need to be prepared to ask patients who come in, have you traveled recently? If they've been to West Africa, to Guinea, Liberia, or Sierra Leone within the past 3 weeks, they need to isolate those patients right away, make sure that they're kept away from other people until they're tested.
So what about these 100 people who are being monitored, who came into may have had some kind of contact with Thomas Duncan? How are they being monitored exactly?
My understanding is that local public health officials are monitoring their fevers and their health status at least twice a day and trying to catch any possible symptoms as early as possible. People who have Ebola virus are not contagious until they have a fever. So they are not a risk to other people while they're quarantined. Quarantine means they've been exposed to someone, but they themselves are not sick. If they turn out to develop a fever, they'll be isolated, which means they'll be in a hospital. Anyone who has contact with them will wear protective gear. And so at this point, it's a waiting game of waiting and observing for at least 21 days to see what happens.
So Kathryn, let's say in the next week or two, one of these 100 people develop symptoms, test positive for Ebola. What then? Is this country prepared?
At that point, the quarantine zone would be expanded to include anyone who had had contact with that person after that person fell sick. But again, because everyone is quarantined, they're going to have very limited human contact with other people. So if they do fall sick, the number of people who would have to be quarantined would be fairly minimal. So the expectation is that very few people will become infected with Ebola as a result of this imported case.
Okay. There's just so many questions, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Kathryn Jacobsen.